So this week we are doing chapter 17, which is weather patterns, and specifically we're doing section 1 on air masses and fronts. So we're going to go over the worksheets from yesterday, but first let's back up a second to the do now for today, which was to look at the weather map for right now. As we take a look at this map, I asked you to identify the types of fronts you see and what types of weather are associated with those, and what type of weather we might be expecting in Colorado today and tomorrow. So first of all, a couple quick thoughts on this map. Who would like to tell me about a front they see? Yes?
I see a purple front, and I'm guessing that that front is like either it's like the front is emotionally confused, and it's not quite sure if it wants to be warm or cold yet, so it's just kind of there, and we'll find out later.
Okay, so this front right here is a front we have not seen before. It is actually in the book as one of the fronts, although in the book they don't show it as purple. What this is, it's called an occluded front. I don't know. An occluded front, you see it has the cold front picture, right, the pointy thing, and the warm front picture, the round thing, and red plus blue is purple. So rather than going in opposite directions like they are on one of these fronts, they're going in the same direction. And I'll show you a picture in a few minutes. But basically, there's three fronts coming together. And occluded, what does occluded mean? If your vision is occluded, what does it mean? Just in everyday language, what's occluded mean? If your vision is occluded, your view is occluded? Nobody? It's cloudy, it's blocked. So the fronts are being blocked from moving. So that's an occluded front. We'll talk about it in a minute. So how about the other fronts that you might know here? What other fronts do we see? Yes. We see a cold front, which is here in blue with the arrows on it. That's a cold front. Pointy, cold. And which direction is it moving? This way, right? It's moving the way the things are pointing. What type of weather does do cold fronts bring? Generally cold weather, but changing weather. And as we'll talk about in a minute, a lot of times the cold fronts, especially around here, they move through very quickly. So it'll be very windy, you have cold weather move through, and then it's sunny. So even though a cold front is cold weather coming through, oftentimes cold fronts are followed by clear weather because they're very often being pushed by high pressure. So you see that's happened here. High pressure moved this through, storms moved through, and now high pressure, clear, sunny weather. So we see that here. Two more types of front real quickly. What types of front do we see here? Warm front, which is this one. Warm fronts, this one's moving this way. And then this front right here, warm and cold smashed together, going in opposite directions. So what's going on there? What direction is it moving? It's not moving. Two things go in the opposite direction, and it's actually called a stationary front. And you see low pressure. Low pressure is generally associated with cloudy or stormy weather. So you have things happening here. Low pressure, it's not moving. So we're going to go over each of these in a little bit more detail, but those are kind of the fronts. So Colorado, what type of weather do we have now and might we be getting? Warm. Is the weather going to be stable or changing? Changing. Why? Because there's a front right here, although it's a stationary front. So, yeah, this is actually a fairly tricky thing. You see thunderstorms here, rain and snow here, but yeah, the stationary front is generally bad weather, rainy weather, and not moving. So that's a little bit of a tricky one to predict. Let's see. And I know that the forecast I saw this morning when I looked had fairly clear weather. So let's see what it says. Oh, here is our local forecast. And so slight chance of showers, mostly sunny, partly cloudy. So it looks like we've got a pattern here over the next couple days of just what you saw. So yeah, clear, fairly nice, but storms moving through and slight chances of those. All right, so let's go back to our stuff for this week. Okay, so first of all, and if you want to follow along on your worksheets, we're going to cover most of this stuff. But let's start with air masses. We will start with types of air masses because a front is going to be where two air masses come together. So we need to know the types of air masses before we talk about the types of fronts. Now, this is pretty straightforward. There are 4 different words that we use to describe an air mass. And an air mass, obviously, is just a whole bunch of air with the same characteristics. And so weather happens as these different air masses move around. So an air mass, just a large area of air that has the same characteristics. What are we looking at for the weather? What are the 4 words we use to describe air masses? Yes. Okay. Maritime. Let's do these. We'll color code them. Maritime, which means what? Okay, so maritime means it forms over the water. And obviously, as that air mass is forming over the water, it has a lot of moisture. So this is a wet air mass. It has high moisture. And then we could have a continental air mass, which forms and so what do we know about its moisture content? Generally a dry air mass, right? Totally logical. So this is not very hard to remember these things. You just need to know that you're going to use these 4 words. Now, what are the other 2 words? So these 2 both obviously have to do with the moisture. What are the other 2 words that describe fronts? I mean, air masses. Okay, tropical, which tells us what about the air mass? Okay, warm air forms in tropics and generally associated with low pressure, right? Because remember, the warm air rises, leaving an area of low pressure. You should be taking notes. You should have either your worksheets from yesterday or paper and taking notes on this, okay? If you have it all filled out, then just add details to it. So low pressure, because the warm air rises, leaving an area of low pressure. And then finally, what is our 4th word to describe types of air masses? Polar. Which tells us what? So not exactly over the poles, but greater than 50 degrees north or south. But what you need to remember is that it's a cold air mass because it doesn't form in the tropics. It forms more over the polar areas. So when we talk about air masses, we talk about, are they hot or cold? Are they wet or dry? And these 4 things are going to determine the weather. Weather, air masses, they always move from an area of high pressure to low pressure. And If it's a wet air mass, you might have precipitation out of it. So pretty logical, right? So then as we look at it, when we talk about the air masses, what you're going to have is you could have continental polar. What type of weather might be associated with a continental polar air mass? Continental polar air mass. Yeah, cold, dry weather. It's going to bring cold air, but not a lot of precipitation. Okay, we do get those. And then you could, of course, also have maritime tropical, which are going to be warm and wet. We also get some of those. And one of the things we'll talk about next week, what happens if you have a continental polar run into a maritime tropical? Tornadoes, yes. No, one's cold and one's warm. So what happens when we look at our weather, very often we get weather that comes down, and in fact a weekend or two ago when we had that snow that got worse than it was supposed to, and it came from the north. What type of air mass do you think that was? It was coming this way. I can't really see the black on there. What type of air mass is coming this way towards us? Continental polar. It brought cold air, and then it ended up, it had a lot of moisture too. If it's coming from here, it's going to be what? Maritime polar, cold and wet. So the storm would come from here and then across. Then in the summer, we oftentimes will get these storms that form over the Gulf of Mexico and then come up. What type of air mass is that going to be? If it formed here, maritime tropical. That's pretty good. It may look like he said that. So, and this is why we get tornadoes in the summer, because we get these warm, wet air masses from the Gulf of Mexico coming up this way, and we get cold, dry air masses coming down this way, and they meet here, and we get cyclones and things like that forming. But that's what's next. But so the air masses are very logical, but that's what's happening. And then when they run into each other is when we get weather. So let's move on to this. So when you have two air masses meet, it's called a front. Before we move on to that, did we get all the stuff on that on the first worksheets, the first two worksheets on air masses? All good? No questions? Awesome. Okay, so where two air masses meet is going to be a type of front, and usually at the area where those meet, you have changing temperature, changing pressure, and you get weather. In this case, which is the same as this picture here, you've got a cold front, where you have the cold air pushing out the warm air. Where's the higher pressure here? Where's the area of high pressure here? Yeah, so you're going to have high pressure. You also know that because it's moving this way, and it'll always move from, oops, an area of high pressure. They always draw the H blue because, yeah, and low pressure. This is, remember our purple front? This is going to be the occluded front. So the purple front on the map is an occluded front. What you have here is a cold front moving in underneath the other two fronts, and so it's all going the same direction, but the warm air is trapped underneath the cold air. So it's not going to move, and you're going to have purple. You're going to have stormier weather. Let's go back here for a minute.
That when it's like warm outside, but then it's raining.
Let's. So taking a quick look at our types of weather and fronts associated with it. So in our weather map, you can have areas of high pressure. Of course, in the United States, weather systems move from west to east. You know that. So areas of high pressure, which is shown by a big blue H. Again, we talked about this, and this was on one of your, in the lab we did, and we've talked about this quite a bit, but people still get mixed up. Why does cold air cause high areas of high pressure? Why does cold air cause areas of high pressure? Yes. Cold air is more dense, and so the cold air is falling, so it's causing areas of high pressure. So those areas of high pressure are usually going to be pushing other things out. So high pressure, and oftentimes, even though it's cold air, the high pressure causes stable weather conditions. So it might push a front through very quickly, but then the weather, if we see a big high pressure zone over the state of Colorado, it probably means it's sunny. We get high pressure in the wintertime and it'll be clear skies, might still be really cold, but generally stable weather. Then, whoops, sunny, stable weather. Then we have low pressure, as we talked about. Low pressure, again, is warm air, the warmer air masses, and shown on the weather map by a big red L, the low pressure is generally changing conditions because the wind is always going from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So if there's low pressure, it's probably going to get pushed out. So changing conditions, usually bringing wind and storms when you have that low pressure. So let's look at our types of fronts. We got the cold front. Hang on a second. I think I've got a separate page with each one of these. So the cold front, the warm front, the stationary front, and the occluded front. And let's put those all on the same page. So what type of weather does each one of these bring? Cold front. What do you have written down? Cold fronts bring what type of weather? You got it on your sheet. What do you have?
They bring like rainy or snowy weather.
They bring, wait, cold front, a cold air mass overtakes a warm air mass.
Okay. So that's how it forms. The cold air mass.
Clouds, rain, snow, and overall cold. Rain. Wait, why do you know why we associate cold with blue and warm with red? Like, what's up with that?
So it often moves through, pushed by the high pressure. Okay, and the warm front. What weather do we have with the warm front? Warm front?
You have light rain, scattered clouds.
And the warm front is usually,
Summertime.
you've got the changing weather. So might have light storms, but warmer weather. The occluded front and the stationary front. Stationary front is the two fronts going opposite directions. Both the occluded front and the stationary front, what happens is they're not really moving, so the weather, you're stuck with it for a longer amount of time. And this one, as you saw, they make that bright pinkish purple. Okay, questions about this? Let's double check and make sure we got everything for your worksheets today.